Evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out to April's special Earth Day edition of TIWLT's Science Cafe talk series. My name is Calder Schweitzer, the Executive Director of the Thousand Islands Watershed Land Trust, and this evening I'm going to be talking about the science of species interactions, or how I fell in love with nature. Now, the reason for this double title is that this is a science cafe. I am going to be talking about scientific theories and principles, but the underlying story behind these principles is that these are the things that I learned about in nature while I was going through my schooling that really ignited my passion for nature, really got me excited to study it, to learn more about it, and eventually put me on the path that I'm on today, pursuing a career in wildlife conservation. When I first started at the University of Guelph, I was actually in biomedical science. I wanted to be a veterinarian, as many people who go to Guelph do. Now, every science student at Guelph is required to take 3 general science classes in their first year. One on human health called Bio 1080, one on microbiology called Bio 1090, and another on biodiversity and ecology called Bio 1070. Now, by the end of the semester, the latter of those ended up actually being my favorite class. I found the subject matter fascinating, and I was very, very eager to dig deeper into the many of the concepts that I learned there. This was the class where I was, sitting in the front row with my, jaw on the floor, just wide-eyed, learning about this great big world around me. And this is the class that sparked my passion for nature that eventually guided me to change majors and pursue a career in wildlife conservation. Now, Bio 1070 introduces a lot of new concepts to first-year students, as it is designed to do, some of which are here on this slide. I credit these concepts, ecosystem function, species interactions, food webs, and predator-prey dynamics, with being the main driving force behind igniting my passion for nature. These were the topics that really, really got me excited, and these were the ones that I pursued and deliberately took classes on as I got further and further into my degree. You'll notice, however, that I've also laid them out in this kind of inverted pyramid style. And the reason for that is because the concepts themselves are only half of the story. One of the greatest discoveries that I made while I was learning about the natural world is how everything, processes, concepts, theories, everything is nested and interconnected. Let me show you what I mean by that. Trust me when I say that this is a relatively simplified diagram of ecosystem functioning. As you can see, there are a lot of connections between the factors that define an ecosystem and its function. Each ecosystem is going to have different values and attributes in these fields, and we can already see a somewhat complicated picture of nature and its interconnectedness. For example, if we isolate just temperature and moisture out of this diagram and consider their effect on the ecosystem, if we're in an area of high temperature and low moisture, we're likely standing in the middle of a desert. But just by changing moisture, if we even keep high temperature and go to high temperature and high moisture, well, that puts us maybe more in the ballpark of a rainforest. And you can see massive changes to what an ecosystem looks like. The functions and the functions that it does are possible just by tweaking little pieces of this diagram. And these are not all of the things that control what the functioning of an ecosystem or what it's going to look like. But this is, as I said, a relatively simplified diagram. However, this is also only a fraction of the story. You see, each of these factors has nested layers of process that affect it, which are in turn affected by their own suite of nested processes. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let's take a look right here near the top at nitrogen mineralization, a process by which nitrogen is made available to living creatures in the soil. It's a vital piece of ecosystem function and affects ecosystems on a broad scale. But nitrogen mineralization is actually only a single part of a broader concept and a broader system called the nitrogen cycle, which is the process by which nitrogen moves through the ecosystem. The facets of the nitrogen cycle on the local scale can affect nitrogen mineralization in a specific ecosystem at a given time, adding a layer of complexity to understanding its place in the broader scope of ecosystem functioning. Let's take a look at another one that I've already talked about a little bit, which is temperature. Well, something that has a huge bearing on the temperature of an ecosystem is the seasonality of the planet. which has a lot to do with the geography of where the ecosystem in question is. And so to perfectly understand temperature in an ecosystem and all the ways that it works in that ecosystem, you also have to understand this planetary system of the seasons and how they're affected by the tilt and the shape of our planet in relation to the sun. Species composition is another factor in the diagram that is affected by another level of complexity, being the ways that those species interact with one another, and how large changes in species composition can happen in response to changes in the species at that smaller level in things like their population size. Hint, hint, we're going to be talking about that later. Litter quantity, litter quality, and soil organic matter quality are all heavily dependent on the carbon cycle, something that is fairly prevalent in the human consciousness today as we talk about our effect on the carbon cycle. But these are part of it as well. Microbial respiration and decomposition from plant biomass, as well as the uptake of the plants into the ecosystem and taking that carbon out of the soil and putting it into a form that living things can use. Those are all affected by the carbon cycle and have a bearing on the litter quantity, litter quality, and soil organic matter quality of a given ecosystem. Moisture, one that we've talked about already as well, is heavily influenced by something I'm sure you're going to be familiar with, which is the water cycle. And local scale changes to the water cycle can have a big change in the moisture in an ecosystem. And so to perfectly understand moisture in an ecosystem, you have to understand the water cycle. Even our measure of ecosystem function itself, net primary productivity, right here at the top of this graph, is heavily influenced by the process of photosynthesis. And so you can start to see how known systems in the natural world can be looked at as being an amalgamation of other systems. And you can continue working through these layers in both directions. For example, if we just zoom into photosynthesis, yes, we need to understand photosynthesis to understand net primary productivity. But what do we need to understand photosynthesis? Or what do we need to understand photosynthesis? Well, we could look at something like this half of the equation, the Calvin cycle, which is just a red circle here in this diagram. If you've ever had the pleasure of learning about photosynthesis and the reactions, you'll know that the Calvin cycle is a ludicrously complicated chemical reaction that is a big system in and of itself. And you can look even further into any of the given steps in the Calvin cycle and look at the reactions that take place on a step-by-step level, zooming in even further. And from this, you can kind of see that there are systems that make up other systems that make up other systems that make up the natural world as we know it. And this is why I like to refer to nature as a system of systems. It's kind of like a nesting doll of scientific theory and observation, leading to ultimately the amalgamation of all of them, which is the most complicated system you can imagine, what we call the natural world. Now, nature is so complicated that it is futile, impossible even to try and model it perfectly. But what we can do is look at each of these systems in isolation and attempt to model them in an effort to better understand how they fit into the system of nature as a whole. And that's what we're going to do with one of the concepts I mentioned before, species assemblage. It's a major component of the functioning ecosystem and has a lot of factors and systems that affect it. So tonight, we're going to zoom in on some of the nested systems within species composition, shrinking gradually in scape to demonstrate how deep this rabbit hole goes, so to speak. So join me, please, as we zoom into our first topic of the evening, which is going to be species interactions. Now, species interactions have a bearing on the species composition in a given ecosystem. The most prevalent and strong example of that would be the presence of invasive species, whereby they have interactions that are so strong they can completely exclude other species from the ecosystem, even species that were there before them. This is the way that species interactions has an effect on the ecosystem, by affecting populations of those interacting species. Now, there are three ways that one species can affect another. It can have a positive effect, it can have a negative effect, or it can have a neutral effect. And by combining any two of these, because interactions tend to happen between two species, we can build a framework to understand each individual reaction. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but it covers the major interactions that species sharing an ecosystem may have, and really are the ones that I think have a bearing on the species composition of an ecosystem, and B, the ones that I think are very cool because, as I mentioned, this is all about the things that really got me excited about nature. So, when two organisms benefit from interacting with each other in this positive relationship or this positive interaction, we call it a mutualism. Now, some people will refer to this as a symbiotic relationship, which is not entirely incorrect. But there are actually three types of symbiotic relationships, not all of which are positive. You see, symbiotic is more of a umbrella term that comes from the Latin for living together and tends to describe species interactions that take place over a longer period of time, as opposed to other interactions that are more collision-based when it comes to species running into each other in the wild. The Latin for symbiotic is, of course, living together. Now, mutualism comes in two flavors. The first, obligate mutualism, is when organisms cannot survive without one another. And the perennial example of this is with coral in our seas. You see, coral, though it looks and functions a lot like a plant in the aquatic ecosystems, is not actually a plant itself. It is a colony of very, very small animals that grow this exoskeleton that fuses together and creates this massive colony. But as a coral, as you can see in this picture on screen, each coral is called a coral polyp. That's the individual animal. And each coral polyp is one of those tiny little rings on the larger coral surface. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, as a coral polyp, you really are 5 tentacles in a mouth. And so you can imagine that it's difficult to actually get a lot of nutrients. It's difficult to find prey, and it's difficult to get the energy that you need to survive. That is where the obligate mutualism comes in, because the coral gets around this challenge by forming a mutualism with a type of photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae. Now, the zooxanthellae also need the coral. You see, the coral benefits because the zooxanthellae are photosynthetic. The zooxanthellae live in the coral skeleton, undergoing photosynthesis and giving the coral its byproducts, most importantly, energy in the form of glucose. Now, I mentioned that the zooxanthellae also needs the coral, and that's because they need a place to be safe from filter feeders and marine herbivores. And so by living within the coral, they have that refuge that they need, as well as being provided the actual chemical components that they need to undergo photosynthesis in the first place. So the zooxanthellae gets the components and the protection to do photosynthesis, and in exchange, the coral gets the energy that results from it. Now, the problem with obligate mutualism, of course, happens when something happens to one of the two organisms involved. For example, with this coral example we're talking about, if the water gets too warm, then the process of photosynthesis, the byproduct, can actually start to harm the coral. And so the coral will expel the zooxanthellae from its body. Of course, this is also the coral getting rid of its major source of energy. And it also tosses the zooxanthellae out into the water, where it is in danger of being predated upon by marine herbivores or filter feeders. This is a process that you might be familiar with. It's called coral bleaching, and you can see it happening right here in this picture. And the reason that the corals turn white is because the zooxanthellae is what actually gives the coral its color. And so when the coral expels the zooxanthellae, the coral turns white, and both are very likely, if not guaranteed, to die shortly after. The second type of mutualism that we have is facultative mutualism, where organisms can survive without one another, but do greatly benefit from each other's presence. This waxwing is eating fruit off of a tree, and so it's getting benefit in the form of food. In return, it spreads the tree's seeds around, increasing the tree's likelihood of reproductive success. These two organisms do not need each other. Surely other trees bear edible fruit for the bird, and the tree's seeds can be dispersed in other ways. But both organisms still benefit from this interaction, and so it is a facultative mutualism. Now, when one species benefits without meaningfully affecting the other one, it's called a commensalism. It's a positive neutral relationship. This squirrel gets a large benefit from the tree in a safe place to sleep, a safe place to hide food, and a safe place to raise its young. The tree, which would likely have this hollow with or without the squirrel, is not meaningfully affected by the squirrel's presence. Commensalism, interestingly, often has a good chance to change to either a positive relationship or a positive negative relationship, depending on the actions of the benefiting species. In our example, the squirrel. You see, if this squirrel was particularly grumpy and it was chasing herbivores away from the tree, well, then it would be protecting the tree's leaves and thus giving it a benefit to having the squirrel there, leading to a mutualism. But if the squirrel were to preferentially hoard the nuts that this tree grows and store them within this hollow, preventing them from being spread far and wide, then the squirrel would be negatively impacting the tree's likelihood of reproductive success, and it could turn into a positive negative relationship, or more specifically, parasitism. Parasitism is when one organism exploits another in the form of a host, directly gaining by taking away something from the host organism. Now, parasitism also comes in two flavors. The first is the one that we know best as humans. It's the one that we have to deal with far more often, which is what I call true parasitism, where the parasite exploits its host, keeping it alive for further exploitation. Now, the famous example of this that jumps into everybody's mind is of course, the mosquito. Though for those of you who are attending tonight from Eastern Ontario, you'll know that a very narrow silver medal goes to the tick, also a parasite that humans have to deal with on a regular basis. Now, as much as we all dislike mosquitoes and ticks, I would rather have them than have a prevalent human version of the second type of parasitism, which is a parasitoid. Because a parasitoid always kills its host during an interaction, like this aphid parasitoid wasp, which actually lays its eggs in the bodies of aphids, which upon hatching and turning into larvae, eat the aphid from the inside out and eventually exit its body through this hole that you can see in the background, turning the aphid into what is very appropriately called an aphid mummy. Now, I'm very glad, as I'm sure many of you are, that we as people do not need to deal with parasitoids, at least here in Canada. Now, if you've ever wondered what an aphid parasitoid wasp might look like to an aphid, there is an example of a human parasitoid that is thankfully fictional that has gained mainstream media success. I am, of course, talking about the xenomorph from the Alien movies. If you know that movie, you know probably almost immediately what scene I'm talking about. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I recommend this movie. It's very interesting. It's a very good movie, as well as being a great example of what a human parasitoid might actually look like and behave like. Now, if two organisms negatively affect each other, it's of course a negative relationship. The example that I'm going to talk about here is competition. As I'm sure you can imagine, as an organism living out in the wild, you need resources, things that are necessary for life and procreation that are in some sort of limited supply. These are things like food, water, sunlight, if you're a plant, or even a mate or territory. And just by the fact that you need those things and you need to gather those resources, you are negatively affecting every other living thing in that ecosystem that also needs those resources, just as they are negatively affecting you. This is the basis of competition. Competition also comes in two different flavors. The first being intraspecific competition, where members of the same species compete for resources, like these two bull moose conspicuously competing likely for a mate or territory. Or the second is interspecific competition, where members of different species compete for resources, like this squirrel that is competing with the nearby birds for the resources out of this bird feeder. Now, as a general rule, intraspecific competition tends to be stronger than interspecific competition because, as I'm sure you can imagine, both of these moose need the exact same resources in roughly the same quantity. So they have a perfect overlap of the things that they're competing for in this ecosystem. Whereas the squirrel does need the same food resource as the birds, but will have different needs when it comes to other aspects of its existence. And so they only overlap in a few areas. And so interspecific competition tends to be a little bit weaker. Now, the last one we're going to talk about is another positive-negative interaction, but it's kind of a special one. We're going to talk a little bit about predation. Predation, of course, is when one species kills another in an attempt to gather its energy and its nutrients, its resources. This one is fairly straightforward from a conceptual standpoint, but has potentially the largest bearing on an ecosystem's species assemblage than any of the other ones I've talked about up to this point. And that is because predation is more or less an inevitability in an ecosystem. If not every, then almost every ecosystem on the planet is going to have predators within it. And the relationship that those predators have with their prey is governed by a set of nested systems that can lead to drastic changes. So let's hyper-focus on predation and the role that this specific species interaction plays when it comes to determining the species composition of a given ecosystem. So we're going to zoom in once again, talk about our next topic of the night, food webs. Now, I am sure that most of you here have heard of, are familiar with at least a food web or the concept of a food web, but for those of you who may not be, I'm sure you've at least heard of the concept of a food chain. You start with a plant, a herbivore eats the plant, the herbivore is eaten by a carnivore, which is eaten by a bigger carnivore. But as we all know, ecosystems are much more complicated like this, and we are likely to have several co-occurring food chains happening within the same ecosystem, within the same geographical area. And in an open system like the natural world, these food chains will not remain internally consistent. And it's an inevitability that individuals from different food chains are bound to interact. And so we can start to draw some connections that we would expect to see in this example ecosystem. We may have organisms that are, higher up in their respective food chains going right to the bottom to get nutrients, and things like omnivorous bears, foxes, and coyotes. Of course, you can imagine that the rabbit and the rat are going to be prey to pretty much everything that is above them in any of these food webs, as they are kind of perennial prey species. The deer, of course, are not safe from bears, nor are the even the upper level carnivores like the fox and the snake, nor are they safe from carnivores that are equal to them or above them in their various food chains. And you can see as we start to draw all of these possible connections throughout the ecosystem, we start to build out this web-like structure, hence the name food web. Now, you may already be able to tell that food webs can generally be laid out into a series of categories, or what we call trophic levels. And every food web is going to be different. They are incredibly complicated, far more complicated than the example we're working through here. But I'm going to give you a basic outline of the trophic levels in an ecosystem and what they mean. The first trophic level of almost every ecosystem is going to be producers. These are the organisms that take energy in a form that is unusable by living things and turn it into a form that is usable by living things. The most obvious example to us as people would be plants that take energy from the sun and turn it into energy in the form of glucose. In areas where the sun doesn't shine, like in hydrothermal vents, there are producers there that turn energy from the hydrothermal vents in the deep sea into energy that can be used by organisms. And so the first level are always producers. Now, of course, intuitively, that means the second level has to be made up of organisms that prey upon the producers. And in terrestrial ecosystems, we call these herbivores. Organisms, animals that eat plants exclusively or almost exclusively. Now, as we move up another level, we start to get to animals that prey upon other animals. And starting at the third trophic level, we start to see the emergence of what we call mesopredators. These are organisms that predate upon organisms that are lower than them in the food web, but are still prey to other creatures that are above them in the food web. Meso meaning middle, predator meaning predator, of course. Now, in real life ecosystems, you could potentially and are in fact likely to have multiple levels of mesopredators. However, in this example, we're just using the third trophic level as a catch-all for all of them. And here in our example, the last trophic level in this food web is the fourth trophic level. And these are the organisms that prey upon other creatures that are below them in the food web and are not prey to anything themselves. These are at the apex of the food web, and so we call them apex predators. Now, apex predators are extremely important when it comes to a food web. So I want to talk a little bit about them. Let's take this simplified food web with a producer, two herbivores, a mesopredator, and two apex predators. Now, the apex predators normally keep the populations of the herbivores and mesopredators in check through a process called top-down control. By hunting the species below them in the food web, the apex predators keep those species' population numbers from increasing to unhealthy levels. However, most ecosystems on Earth have undergone a paradigm shift in recent years because one species has positioned itself at the top of almost every food web in the world. And though it doesn't directly hunt and eat the other apex predators necessarily, its effect on them is similar to how an apex predator affects the species below it. I am, of course, talking about humans. Since humans began dominating planet Earth, we've often viewed apex predators as dangerous, as pests, or threats to be eliminated. They are often heavily hunted, often to extinction. And those that are not hunted suffer in other ways through habitat loss, urbanization, and other threats to their natural way of living. As a result, many ecosystems have lost the apex predators that keep them in check, sometimes with disastrous results. Let's have a look at our simplified food web here, for example. Let's say that the humans come into this ecosystem, see the bears, and think, those are dangerous animals, we need to get rid of them. And they hunt the bears out of the ecosystem. Now, there are a few things that we can expect to see happen. And the disclaimer I want to give here is that this is never a scripted process. It's very hard to tell what the impact of losing a species is going to be on an ecosystem, but there are a few general trends that we can work through and outline to make a semi-accurate prediction of the patterns we might expect to arise. The first is a process called mesopredator release, where we would expect the population of our mesopredator to increase in response to having one of their natural predators and competitors taken out of the ecosystem. If we look below at this bottom branch, then we can see that functionally, the deer have moved up very far into in the food web and are now essentially an apex predator. They are prey to things below them, but not prey to anything above them. And so we would expect the deer population to absolutely balloon here as well, which sounds fantastic if you're a deer. But if you've ever visited Hill Island, you know exactly what is going to come next. Because of course, all of these deer must eat. And so we could expect to see a massive decline in the food resources that are available to those deer in their ecosystem. And now we have this very bad situation of having a massively inflated population with insufficient resources to support that population. And so we would expect to see the deer crash, potentially to zero. Now, unfortunately, the rest of the ecosystem is not getting away scot-free. If you pay attention to the rabbits, you can see now they have pressure from the top down with an increased population of one of their natural predators, as well as pressure from the bottom up with a sudden lack of resources for them because all the plants have been eaten by the deer. And so we would expect to see a precipitous drop in the rabbit population. And now the animation may have given it away. But we see the same thing that happened with the deer is now happening to the fox. We have an inflated population, insufficient resources to sustain them, and the foxes are going to crash. Now, in response, this is going to be a little bit of competition gone for the eagles, who may see a slight increase. But at the end of the day, they're still going to have this large population with not enough resources to sustain them. And we expect to see the rabbits decrease and the eagles to follow shortly after. And you can see that just by removing one species, the apex predator, from this system, the whole thing collapses into chaos and potentially goes extinct entirely. Now, the good thing is we don't see ecosystems collapsing every day, and that is in large part because of the layers of systems that hold them up that I've been talking about since the beginning of the talk. Just like we've been talking about with all of nature, there are nested systems that maintain a level of stability within ecosystems. Here, we're going to talk about two concepts that build stability in ecosystems so that they might do better in the face of changes to their food web. First, we're going to talk about the bird feeder effect, and then we're going to go into the weak interaction effect. Now, the bird feeder effect is fairly straightforward. It states that as you get higher up in your trophic position, as you move up the food web, you are likely to hunt or gather resources across a larger number of habitats. So we might have our very immobile herbivores down here in the bottom that are really confining themselves to one habitat. And then as we move up with the mesopredators, we might expect to see them go a little bit further afield. And eventually, when we get all the way up to the apex predators, we know that they tend to have massive territories, very, very large home ranges, which allow them to hunt across several habitats in the course of their regular activities. Now, how exactly does this build stability in an ecosystem? Well, let me recontextualize this graph. Let's say that we have this generalist predator whose territory spans 4 different habitats. If something were to happen to one of those habitats, like say a wildfire, that would diminish its ability to provide resources for that generalist predator, the generalist predator still has options, and it can just go to another one of these habitats, another area of its territory, and begin to take resources from that area, applying a predation pressure to it. Now, while it's preoccupied in this bottom right corner of its territory, we might expect to see the other ones increase because there is less of a predation pressure on them, and they might become a little more productive. We might see higher population rates in those local areas of the ecosystem. And so when the predator is finished taking resources from this section of its territory down here, it is free to move up here to another part of its large home range. And this accomplishes 2 things. First, it removes the predation pressure from the bottom right ecosystem, the diminished ecosystem, which gives it an opportunity to bounce back and rebuild its population that has been affected by the generalist predator. The other thing that happens is that the generalist predator arrives and applies its predation pressure to this booming ecosystem, preventing any of the populations from getting too large and potentially causing a collapse like we saw in the previous slide. That collapse is called a trophic cascade, where one change to the ecosystem cascades throughout the rest of the ecosystem in the food web and affects the populations of other species. This is one of the effects that can help stop trophic cascades. And the other benefit is that while the predator is busy in these other areas of its territory, then that gives the degraded ecosystem potential and opportunity to recover from the initial disturbance and bounce back, increasing its population levels as a response. That is how the bird feeder effect builds stability in ecosystems. The generalist predator is there to keep booming ecosystems in check, and because it has many different habitats to draw from, it is able to avoid the ones that have lower resources, giving them a chance to recover. Now, the second way that we build stability in ecosystems is through something called the weak interaction effect. And to understand the weak interaction effect, we have to first understand interaction strength. Now, the scientific definition of interaction strength is the rate of flow of biomass per unit of consumer per unit of resource between the consumer and the resource, which kind of sounds like gibberish and means precisely nothing to a lot of people. So really, what this boils down to is the collision rate of consumers and resources. How often are the consumers and resources actually meeting each other out in the field? And what is the likelihood of the consumer actually harvesting the resource? If we're looking at predation, specifically, what is the likelihood of a predator having a successful hunt? This can be affected by things like mobility, how often, if they're very mobile, that will affect how often they actually run into each other and meet in the world. The metabolism of the predator will determine how often it has to wait between hunts, which will, of course, determine the collision rate and thus the interaction strength. The abundance of both, of course, has an effect. If they are both very abundant, the predator and the prey, they will run into each other more often. And if there's a specialization or a preference by the predator for a specific prey, then that will also increase interaction strength because they're only going to be pursuing one of those, one potential resource, as opposed to having interactions with many sources. Now, the weak interaction effect states that the more weak interactions you have in an ecosystem, the more stable it's going to be. And to demonstrate that, let's first look at this very small, high interaction strength food web. Here we can imagine that if anything happened to any piece of it, there would be a lot of trouble. But if we add a second consumer to the food web, even with a weak interaction with the resource denoted by this dotted line, it will still confer a small level of stability. For example, if the resource here was a small animal like an insect, the consumers may be keeping its population from exploding and causing damage. And having a second consumer in that system predates on the insect, even to a small degree, will relieve some pressure on consumer one and maintain some stability in the ecosystem if consumer one disappears. Now, in this case, consumer two is both predator to the resource and prey to the apex predator, meaning it fills a similar role or niche as consumer one. If consumer one disappears, then consumer two is there as a safety net for the predator and an emergency backstop for the resource, keeping things in balance. In this case, it's likely that the interaction would become stronger between consumer two and its connections in the absence of consumer one, if something were, of course, to happen to consumer one. This concept of interaction strength plays a very interesting role, especially when considering what these theories look like on the species level. How do strong interactions actually affect the stability of species, a food web, and an ecosystem? To understand that, we need to zoom in one more time to one of the systems that underlies the weak interaction effect and our final topic, predator-prey dynamics. Now, as we start talking about predator-prey dynamics, there are two concepts that I have to introduce to you. The first is this little r, which is the symbol that we use in ecology to represent population growth rate. Very broadly, births minus deaths. How much is your species population increasing or decreasing in a given year? The second one is carrying capacity, which we represent with the capital K. And this is the number of individuals of a single species that can be supported by an ecosystem. This is the point where births equal deaths, or the point where R, population growth rate, equals 0. Now, one of the ways that we talk about predator-prey dynamics is with the very exciting discipline of graphical analysis. And so we're going to do a little bit of graphical analysis here tonight. Here we have two graphs that plot predator density on the y-axis and prey density on the x-axis. Each of the lines that we have plotted here represents the carrying capacity of one of these two species in relation to the population of the other one. So here along the x-axis, we have prey density. And so this hump shape, this parabola, is the point at which prey population growth equals 0. This is the carrying capacity of the prey in relation to the predator population, and is also known as the prey isocline. Now here on the right-hand graph, we have a critical value of prey density that you can see has a bearing on predator density. This is the point at which predator population growth equals 0. This is also the prey density that puts the predator at its carrying capacity, or the predator isocline. Now, what we really care about are the arrows in relation to these isoclines. As you can see, under the prey isocline, under this blue hump, you can see that prey density tends to increase. outside of the prey isocline, you can see that prey decreases. So if you are plotting a point on a graph and you fall right here, well, you can expect in the population the prey to decrease. But if your point on your graph falls here, you can expect prey to increase. And the same is for the predators. If you are to the right of this critical level of prey density, you can expect the predator population to increase. If you're to the left of this critical value for prey density, you can expect the predator population to decrease. Now, this is all well and good, but we really start to get to tell stories when we combine these graphs. So let's look at an inefficient predator. This is a relationship where the predators are at equilibrium at high prey density. You can see that this purple line sits, which remember represents the point at which the predators are neither growing nor shrinking in their population. You can see that that point is at relatively high prey density. This is an inefficient predator or a weak interaction, as we talked about before when we were talking about the weak interaction effect. This would represent a predator that either does not have many successful hunts or is successful, or it does not have a high success to attempt ratio when it comes to hunting. This could be a predator that does not preferentially hunt this prey and so doesn't have a meaningful effect on its or a very meaningful effect on its population. There are all sorts of reasons that this could happen, but this is an inefficient predator or a weak interaction. Now, let's say that we are looking to plot a point that represents the ratio of predators to prey, the population size of each of these species in the ecosystem. If our point falls right here in this kind of quadrant, you can see we're going to fall underneath the prey isocline, underneath this blue hump, and we're going to fall to the right of this predator isocline, to the right of the purple line. And so because we're under the prey isocline, because we're under the prey isocline, prey increase. And because we're to the right of the predator isocline, predators increase. And so we plot those vectors on the graph and then combine them to see where as a ratio these populations are going to go. We would expect it to move generally in this direction. Now, there's an important thing to know here, and that is that while we do approach these isoclines, it's very unlikely that we're actually going to land on them. And that's because of something called a time lag, which really is just the time it takes for a biological system to respond to changes. This is caused by things like gestation time, primarily when we're talking about population growth. Of course, it takes time for the population of a species to increase in response to a stimulus from outside. And so you're unlikely to ever actually land on this line. What you're going to do is cross it. And so if we follow the sum of these two vectors, this brown arrow, we cross into this section. You can see now that the population has moved here into high prey and high predators, we have crossed the prey isocline. And so the prey is going to decrease because we're now outside of the hump. But we are still to the right of the purple line. We're still to the right of the predator isocline. So the predators will still be increasing. So our vector comes out looking like this. Now, as you can see, we're going to move in this direction. We are eventually going to cross the predator isocline. So we are now still outside the prey isocline. We haven't crossed that one. So prey are still decreasing. But now we are to the left of the predator isocline, and so the predators are also going to decrease. And so we move in this direction. And then, as if you follow the brown line, you can see we're going to move into this quadrant where we cross the prey isocline again, and so prey will begin to increase once more. But we are still to the left of the predator isocline. We come down into this area, and so the predators are still decreasing. And so we move in this direction. Now, what's important to see is that really, no matter, I do want to bring a little bit of attention to these first, because look at when you're going at the points where both are increasing or both are decreasing, you can see that you don't have to go very far to cross an isocline. Keep that in mind. But when we look at these vectors as a whole, we can see that no matter where you start, the population is going to move to equilibrium. The population is going to move, generally spiral toward this center point where theoretically neither the prey or the predator are changing in their population. That makes this a stable system. We don't expect to see massive populations of predator or prey or very, very small populations of predator or prey. We tend to stay near this intersection. Now, in contrast to that, let's have a look at an efficient predator or a strong interaction. This is when the predator are at equilibrium when the prey is at low density. This could be a predator that is very good at hunting its prey. This could be a predator that only hunts one type of prey. For whatever reason, these two run into each other in the ecosystem all the time. And so they have a strong interaction. So you can see at low prey density, the predators are at equilibrium. And we can plot points in much the same way. When we're here, you can see we're to the right of the predator isocline, so the predators increase, but we are under the prey hump, so the prey also increase, and we move in this direction. However, remember when I told you in the last example that we don't have to go far to cross an isocline when both are increasing or both are decreasing? Well, have a look at this one here. You can see when both are increasing, the prey are going to increase dramatically before we cross the prey isocline. And remember, we are also going to overshoot. So it's possible that we're actually going to go all the way up here and maybe land somewhere like this. Now we are outside of the prey isocline. So we do eventually start to decrease in the prey. And we are to the right of the predator isocline. So the predators are still increasing. And so we move in this direction. But you can see we have a massive prey population now a massive prey population and a massive predator population that is still increasing. If we go to over here where both are decreasing, we can see that in this case, the line doesn't actually cross an isocline once both start to decrease. And so theoretically, this could decrease until it hits one of the axes or the origin, which represent extinction, complete loss of either or both of these species from the ecosystem. Now, the good thing is that, as I've been saying since the beginning, nature is full of nested processes that keep things stable. So in a situation like this, while it is a distinct possibility that we move and hit one of these axes and see the extinction of one of these species, what is also likely is that we end up somewhere down here, where we just cross the prey isocline. And so the prey do get a chance to recover. You see we're under the hump, and so the prey start to increase. We've come underneath the prey isocline, but we are still to the left of the predator isocline. So the predators are still decreasing. And so we move in this direction and could land somewhere here. And now you see we kind of repeat the process where the prey can increase because we're underneath the prey isocline. The predators, now that we've crossed the predator isocline, will start to increase again. But now look at how far we have to go before we cross the prey isocline, before anything starts to change. And of course, we're going to overshoot that. We may end up way out here, which is going to land us a massive prey population and a massive and still growing predator population. And so you can see that with an efficient predator like this, that keeps itself at equilibrium with the prey at low density, we can expect to see these massive, massive swings where we have a few years where both are very, very good, both have very, very high populations, followed by a precipitous crash where both risk extinction. And the thing that is absolutely incredible to me, you see that this is an unstable system. And the thing that is absolutely incredible to me is that while working this out through graphical analysis is all well and good, and we can talk about theoreticals, until we're blue in the face, this is actually something that is observed in empirical data. And the most famous example of that is the relationship between Lynx canadensis, the Canadian lynx, and Lepus americanus, the snowshoe hare. This graph shows population data for these two organisms over the course of about 100 years. The hares are in red and the lynx are in blue. Now, as you can see, we are seeing those rises and falls, those booms and busts that we conceptually talked about in the last slide. Let's look right here. At their highest point, the rabbits have a population of, that would be what, almost 200,000? And near their lowest, we can see they have a population of maybe 10,000. And that change happens over the course of a couple of years. That's how quickly all of this can happen, which is part of the reason that it's so absolutely fascinating. The other thing that we can see is the changes in both of them and how they respond to each other. So if we start right here, where the rabbits are very, very low, we can see they start to increase and they hit this maximum that we pointed out a second ago. Well, you can see while they're at their maximum, while they're doing their best, if we follow down to the same year, we can see the lynx have a comparatively low population, but are on the rise because their prey is increasing. But you can see right around the time that the lynx hit their apex, and over the course of the years that they're increasing, the rabbits begin to experience a precipitous drop. And very shortly after we see the spike in the lynx population, we see a valley in the rabbit population. And as the rabbits crash, we can see all of a sudden, remember, high population and no resources to support it, the lynx begin to crash as well. And as the lynx reach this, this critical point, this rock bottom in their population, all of a sudden there's less predation pressure on the rabbits or on the hares, which have an opportunity to increase as well. You can see they hit this critical mass, this critical population, and a couple years later, the lynx spike. And as the lynx spike, hares start to decrease, and as the hares start to decrease, the lynx start to decrease in response. And so these two organisms, because they have such a strong interaction between them, are locked in this kind of endless dance with their populations booming and busting, having massive success and then crashing nearly to extinction every few years. That is how strong interactions create instability in an ecosystem. And so let's kind of bring it all together. Let's imagine, for example, that in this massively unstable system with these boom and busts, we come to this year here where the rabbits are very, very low, 10,000 or less. Let's say that this also happens to be a drought and plants have a terrible time and there's all of a sudden a lack of food for the rabbits. Well, it is a distinct possibility that in this bust season, with all of a sudden extra pressure coming on the rabbits, that their population may crash to zero. And we can follow now all of the connections we've made zooming in back out by looking at what would happen to the ecosystem if these rabbits crash to zero. If these rabbits crash to zero, imagine all of the organisms in the food web that are connected to them, to the snowshoe hare, that are then going to have changes to their interaction. In response to that, there are going to be changes with all of the species that interact with those species that depended on the snowshoe hare, because we expect many of these dependent species to decrease as well. And so the organisms that interact with those species are going to see an effect. And if those organisms see an effect, then we can start to see an effect on the species assemblage of the entire ecosystem. And of course, you can see with species assemblage or species composition here, it's connected to other parts of the ecosystem. And so having changes to the species composition could change the way an ecosystem looks and the functions that it has. So if you take anything away from this evening's presentation, this should be it. Because of the interconnectedness of nature, small changes can have ramifications on the ecosystem level scale. We zoomed into one specific interaction between species and worked backwards to show how a change in that interaction can cascade up the hierarchy of systems to affect the entire ecosystem. Now imagine all of the other predator-prey interactions happening at the same time, all of the other species interactions happening at the same time, all of the other ecosystem, geological, and planetary processes that are happening together to create the natural world as we know it. The vastness of it is impossible to imagine. And one of the things that really fascinates me to this day is that no person created this. We tend to think of hierarchical systems as human concepts, like in machines and assembly lines and our complex cultures and our complex economies. But nature is actually a demonstration of a hierarchy of systems that is so complex that we can't even begin to understand it fully, much less try and mimic it. These would exist whether we were here to observe them or not. And if I can get really big picture for a second, in a way, observing the process of nature and how it organizes itself through no human intervention into these nested systems of nested hierarchical systems, we can directly observe the natural state of the universe at work. And I think that is absolutely fascinating. When you look at an ecosystem with this in mind, you can start to see that everything is connected to everything else. And all of these systems, these massively complex systems that go together to create the natural world that we see around us, are so complicated, are so representative of a living laboratory, of something that is right in front of us that we can learn infinite amounts of information from. And that is why I think that nature is so important to protect. That is why our natural ecosystems and the processes that prop them up are so worthy of conservation. And that is the core, that is the nucleus of my passion for nature and why I decided to pursue a career in wildlife conservation. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I hope that maybe a little bit of your passion for nature was ignited here as well. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a great night.